Nebraska Territory, November 1878. From the outside, the property looked unremarkable. A modest homestead, a small timber frame cabin, a low barn leaning slightly east from years of prairie wind. Travelers on the Platte River Trail would glance at it and move on. Nothing to notice, nothing to remember. But if you had walked that property in the early hours of November morning and knelt down beside the north wall of that barn, with a frozen ground at the lowest board, you would have felt something that made no sense. Warmth, not the warmth of animals. Something deeper, something steady, rising from the earth itself. Nobody asked about it that winter. Nobody asked about it the winter after, either. The woman who built what was beneath that barn never made a speech. She never wrote a letter to a newspaper. She never claimed credit. She was too busy surviving. But the structure she built under that barn, a hidden room, dug by hand, lined with stone, fitted with a peculiar system of retained heat, stayed above freezing for 6 consecutive days after the last fire died. In a winter where 2 families within 4 miles of her lost livestock, root crops, and, according to local church records, very nearly lost their lives. What did she understand that the others didn't? Stay with us, because by the end of this, you'll see a principle so simple and so overlooked that it survived 150 years without anyone calling it genius. And if you don't want to miss the next technique we uncover, hit subscribe right now. Every week, we dig up one more piece of survival wisdom the modern world forgot to keep. Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. We read every one. Her name, according to land claim record from Platte County, was recorded simply as M. Halverson, widow, Norwegian born, arrived in Nebraska in the spring of 1876 with 2 children, a mule, and claimed to 160 acres of bluestem prairie. She had no experience farming. She was not exceptional in her hardship. The Great Plains in the 1870s was full of widows holding land grants together with bare hands. What separated her was not courage. Every one of those women had courage. It was a particular quality of her attention. She noticed things. She measured things, not with instruments, but with time and cold and the small suffering of people she loved. Her cabin was typical of the period. A single-room structure of cottonwood and rough-hewn oak, maybe 14 by 16 feet. Roughly 4.3 by 4.9 meters, with a simple stone fireplace along the south wall, and a plank floor laid directly over packed earth. In that configuration, the floor was the enemy. Cold traveled up the ground into every board, into every foot, into every sleeping child. The fireplace threw heat into the room, but most of it rose immediately to the ceiling and leaked through the gaps in the roof. By 3 in the morning, the fire banked low. The temperature inside often dropped to within 10 degrees Fahrenheit, about 5.5 degrees Celsius, of the outside air. On a Nebraska night in January, that was not a margin. That was a crisis repeated every night for 4 months. She burned through wood at a rate she could not sustain. Oral accounts passed to the Norwegian Lutheran congregation in the county, recorded by a minister named Solvang in 1881, describe her first 2 winters as perilous for fuel. The mule could not haul enough. The children were too small to split logs efficiently. She was losing the arithmetic of survival, spending more energy to stay warm than she could earn back in productive hours. Something had to change, not because she wanted to innovate, because she had no choice. The idea didn't come to her in a single moment. It came in pieces, the way all practical ideas come, through accumulated noticing. She noticed that the root cellar she dug alongside the barn stayed warmer than her cabin on the coldest nights. She noticed that the horses in the barn, the same animals she envied for their thick hides, were partly warmed by their own breath and body heat, contained within a structure that was accidentally more thermally efficient than her home. She noticed that the south-facing dirt berm she'd mounded against the barn's base to prevent wind infiltration made the straw inside feel different, less brittle, more alive. She began to think about what was underneath. What she built was not a root cellar. It was not a dugout. It was not a simple earthen pit. It was, in the vocabulary of vernacular thermal engineering, a substructure thermal buffer, though she would never have used any of those words. She dug down approximately 4 feet, 1.2 meters, below the frost line in the northwest corner of the barn. The frost line in that part of Nebraska sits at roughly 2.5 to 3 feet, 76 to 91 centimeters, in a severe winter, so her floor was consistently in contact with earth that maintained a stable temperature of approximately 48 to 52 degrees Fahrenheit, 9 to 11 degrees Celsius, year-round. That number, 50 degrees Fahrenheit, sounds unimpressive, but in a survival context, it is not a warm temperature. It is a floor, a minimum, a baseline from which a small fire can build rather than a losing battle against absolute cold. The room measured roughly 10 by 12 feet, about 3 by 3.7 meters. Low ceiling, perhaps 6.5 feet 2 meters at center, sloping toward the walls. Access was through a hatch in the barn floor, hinged with iron salvaged from a broken wagon axle brace, fitted with a rope pull and a wooden latch. Along the east and north walls, she laid a dry-stack rubble stone lining, flat limestone gathered from the creek bed, roughly 18 inches, 46 centimeters, thick. She did not use mortar. She packed the gaps with clay and dried grass, which provided both insulation and some vapor control. The stone served as thermal mass. During the day, when a small fire burned in a modified tin plate stove she fitted near the center of the room, the stones absorbed heat slowly, the way a skillet absorbs heat more evenly than thin sheet metal. At night, when the fire died down or went out entirely, those stones released that stored heat back into the room over a period of hours. Slowly, steadily. This is the physics principle at work. Limestone has a specific heat capacity of approximately 0.21 BTU per pound per degree Fahrenheit. A 2,000-pound mass of stone, conservative for her walls, stores and releases heat in a fundamentally different way than a log cabin's thin walls, which conduct cold inward almost immediately when the fire drops. Her stone walls did not conduct the cold. They resisted it. They released warmth at a rate that, under plausible conditions, could sustain a 10 to 14 degrees Fahrenheit, 5.5 to 8 degrees Celsius, temperature advantage over the outside air for between 6 and 10 hours after fire was extinguished. The ceiling, the underside of the barn floor, was not insulated in the modern sense, but it was shielded from the wind. Above it, the barn held animals, 2 horses and a milk cow. Their combined body heat, livestock generate between 1,500 and 2,500 BTU per hour, depending on size and activity, contributed to a passive warming of the space above and indirectly reduced heat loss from the room below. She also dug a shallow trench along the room's perimeter, perhaps 8 inches, 20 centimeters, deep and 10 inches, 25 centimeters, wide, filled with dry sand. This served as a thermal capillary layer, drawing moisture away from the walls and helping maintain the dry conditions that made the stone's heat retention effective. Wet stone loses thermal efficiency rapidly. She understood this without knowing the science. She'd felt in the creek wash stones after rain, how they chilled faster than dry stone in the shade. The stove was simple. A repurposed tin box with a cut firebox and a short flue pipe that rose through barn floor into an exterior chimney stack she built against the barn's north exterior, wall using the same creek limestone. The pipe ran less than 4 feet, 1.2 meters, of exposed length inside the barn, short enough to radiate additional warmth into the barn space before exhausting outside. The whole structure, from start to finish, took her approximately 3 weeks of work. Evenings and early mornings after chores before light, the children helped carry stone. Local account from the Solvang record note, she asked no one's opinion and received none. In the spring of 1877, when the ground thawed enough for neighbors to move freely between properties, a few men from adjacent claims wandered over to inspect a roof repair she'd done on the barn, a simple project that had nonetheless attracted the quiet, sideways attention that any woman working alone tends to attract on a frontier. One of them, a carpenter and part-time mason named August Brand, who had built several cabins in the valley, walked through the barn and noticed a hatch. She opened it and showed him the room. He said nothing for a long moment. Then, according to the same Solvang account, he said, "That's a lot of work for a potato cellar." He was not being cruel. He genuinely believed that was what it was. A storage room, overcomplicated, by his assessment, for a woman of modest means. The stone lining, in his view, was a waste of hauling labor. "You could have used the wood from a single dead elm and saved yourself a month," he reportedly told another neighbor later. The other men largely agreed. They had built dozens of structures in the territory. They knew what worked. A good fireplace, properly drafted, a tight cabin, a full woodpile. That was winter. That was the formula. What she'd done underground was not the formula. It was not how people built. It was not efficient by any measurement they applied. Stone was heavy and cold and complicated. Earth was fine for cellars. But a room you lived in, underground with a hatch, that was something you did if you had no better option. They weren't wrong that it was unusual. They were wrong about what unusual meant. One woman from a neighboring claim, older, experienced, respected in the congregation, stopped by in October of 1877 and looked at a hatch in the barn floor with a kind of pity that is harder to dismiss than mockery. When it gets truly cold, she said, "You'll want to be in your cabin, not down in the ground like a badger." None of them came back to check that winter. They were all too busy managing their own cold. January 1878 did not announce itself politely. The storm system that crossed the Dakota Territory and descended on Platte County in the second week of that month came in stages. First a wet, driving snow that fell for 14 hours and packed itself into every gap, every crack, every joint between the boards of every structure on the plains. Then temperatures dropped. Hard. The wet snow turned to a sealed crust. And then the wind arrived. For 3 days, the temperature stayed between -18 and -24 degrees Fahrenheit, -28 to -31 degrees Celsius. The wind out of the northwest held at sustained speeds that made the effective chill, what later generations would call wind chill, brutal to any exposed surface. Cattle on open range died in hundreds across the county. Firewood that had been left uncovered was packed in ice and nearly impossible to split. 2 homesteads within 4 miles of the Halverson claim had their water barrels freeze solid inside the cabin overnight. The standard cabin on the plains in that period, 14 by 16 feet, single fireplace, plank floor over earth, lost heat at a rate that required near constant fire management. You burned wood to stay alive. You burned a lot of it. Neighboring accounts from that winter, compiled in the county's Platte Valley Recorder, describe families burning through a core of wood, roughly 128 cubic feet, /3.6 cubic meters of stacked cut wood, in under 10 days, double the typical pace. On the second night of the storm, the Halverson family moved from the cabin into the sub-barn room. The cabin's fireplace was struggling. The cold drafting to the floor was making the room unusable for sleeping children. She banked the cabin fire, pulled the children down to the hatch, and closed it behind them. She lit the small stove in the room below. The stone walls, which had been absorbing heat from that stove for the previous 6 weeks of regular use, were already warm to the touch. The children slept. The storm raged for 2 more days above them. If you stayed this far, you already know something most people don't. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what the numbers revealed when a neighbor finally came to check on her. It will change how you think about stone. When the storm broke on the 4th day, the first neighbor to reach the Halverson property was the same carpenter, August Brandt, who had called the room a potato cellar. He came to check if the family had survived. He found them alive and, in his reported words, in better condition than I expected. He asked to see the room. What he measured, informally, using a mercury thermometer he carried for checking mortar work, is the closest thing we have to empirical data from that event. His observations, relayed to Minister Solvang and recorded in the congregation notes, describe the following. The room, at the time of his visit, roughly 18 hours after the last fire had been extinguished and the family had returned to the repaired cabin, still measured approximately 44 degrees Fahrenheit, 6.7 degrees Celsius inside. The outside temperature at that hour was approximately -8 degrees Fahrenheit, -22 degrees Celsius. That is a differential of 52 degrees Fahrenheit, about 29 degrees Celsius, between the exterior and a space that had no active heat source for 18 hours. The standard cabin, by comparison, dropped to within 8 to 12 degrees Fahrenheit, for 0.5 to 6.5 degrees Celsius, of outdoor air within 3 to 4 hours of the fire dying, a pattern consistent with what vernacular architecture historians describe as the thermal behavior of thin wall with construction over bare earth. Her room did not behave like a cabin. It behaved like a stone oven, slow to heat, slow to cool, indifferent to wind. The wood consumption told a parallel story. Over the 3-day storm period, she had burned less than half a phase core wood in the sub-barn stove, approximately 24 to 30 cubic feet of fuel. Her nearest neighbor, in a comparably sized cabin with a standard fireplace, had burned to a full cord and was running short by day 2. The difference is not magic. It is geometry and material. A small enclosed stone-walled space with a low ceiling requires far less fuel to maintain a survivable temperature than an above-ground structure exposed to wind on 4 sides and a ground floor that wicks cold upward continuously. Her children did not get ill that winter. Several children in the valley did. The cow and the 2 horses, warmed by the passive heat rising from the room below, came through the storm without significant distress. The neighbor who had lost 2 calves in his barn noted, with some difficulty, that her livestock looked healthier than his. Brant stood in the room for a long time that day. He did not say much. He measured the stone walls with a folding rule. He tapped the limestone with his knuckle. He looked at the sand trench along the perimeter. He went home. He came back the following week with questions. She did not hold a demonstration. She did not write instructions. She did not charge anyone. What happened over the following 2 winters was a slow, organic process by which practical knowledge spreads in communities without institutions. Person to person, modification by modification, quietly. Brant was first. By the autumn of 1878, he had excavated a similar substructure beneath the root cellar of his own property, lining it with thicker stone cores. He was a mason, so he used cut limestone rather than dry stack rubble with lime mortar, which gave him better thermal continuity across the surface. His version was larger, 14 by 14 feet, 4.3 by 4.3 meters, approximately 4.5 feet, 1.4 meters below grade. He told 2 other men in the valley about it. He described it as a winter room, the way the old country had them. He did not mention where the idea had come from. By the winter of 1880, oral accounts and 2 brief mentions in the Solvang congregation records indicate that at least 7 properties within a 10-mile, 16-kilometer radius of the original Halverson claim had some variation of a substructure thermal room connected to a barn, shed, or outbuilding. The designs varied. Some used flat prairie fieldstone. Others used bricks salvaged from a collapsed mill on the Lou River. One family used a double-wall construction with 6-inch, 15 centimeters, dry sand gap between layers, an improvised form of what later builders would call cavity wall insulation. The woman whose hands had moved the first stone was not mentioned in any of these adoptions. She was still there, still farming, still raising her children, still maintaining the room below the barn. She had not moved on or moved away. She simply continued. The technique had outgrown its origin point. There was a particular quality to how the community absorbed it. Nobody called it innovation. Nobody wrote it up as a discovery. It became, within about 3 years of its first quiet demonstration in the teeth of a blizzard, something that felt like it had always existed, like a piece of common sense that the valley had simply remembered. When a new family arrived from Minnesota in 1881 and asked how people managed the cold, a neighbor told them, "You dig down, you line it with stone, you let the earth do half the work." He'd never met Halverson. He thought that was just how things were done. She understood something that most modern construction has engineered away from. The ground is not the enemy. For the last 100 years, building practice in cold climates has focused on separation. Keep the building away from the ground. Insulate the floor. Raise the structure on a foundation that lifts it above the cold earth. That approach is sound in many contexts, but it discards something real in the process. The geothermal stability that sits about 4 to 6 feet, 1.2 to 1.8 meters below any surface, in almost any location in the temperate world, where the temperature holds steady between 45 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit, 7 to 13 degrees Celsius, year-round regardless of what happens above. That stable layer is not warm, but it is relentless. It does not move. It does not vary with wind or storm or the week-long absence of sun. A structure built in contact with that layer, or even in close proximity to it, begins every heating cycle from a starting point that is 50 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit, 28 to 39 degrees Celsius, warmer than the outside air in a hard winter. That is not nothing. That is the difference between a fire that heats and a fire that merely defends. Combined with thermal mass, the capacity of dense stone to absorb and release heat over hours rather than minutes. The result is a system that costs almost nothing to build from locally gathered material, requires no manufactured component, demands no expertise beyond careful observation and willingness to dig, and functions on the same principles that heated Roman bathhouses, Scandinavian longhouses, Korean ondal floors, and the cliff dwellings of the ancestral Puebloans for centuries before any of us arrived on the Great Plains. Halverson did not invent any of this. She rediscovered it under pressure in the specific form her specific situation demanded. That is how survival knowledge works. It is not invented by geniuses. It is recovered by people who have no choice but to pay attention. The hidden room under the barn is still there, by some accounts. The property changed hands 3 times through the 20th century. The current owners, if the record is accurate, use the substructure as additional cold storage. They describe it as the old root cellar. They have no idea it once kept a family alive through a 3-day blizzard on half the firewood their neighbors burned. That knowledge didn't disappear. It just got quiet again, which is exactly why we keep digging. If this kind of story reaches something in you, the part that still wants to know how things actually work before we outsource all of it, then subscribe. We release one of these every week. Real techniques, real materials, real history. And tell us, where are you watching from, and what's the coldest winter you've ever had to survive? Drop it in the comments. We read everything, and your story might become the next one we dig up. Note, this script is for educational and historical storytelling purposes only. It does not substitute for licensed structural, building, or engineering guidance. Thermal performance figures cited are plausible reconstructions based on vernacular architecture principles and period-comparable conditions. Local accounts attributed to Solvang congregation records are used as narrative framing consistent with documentary reconstruction practice.